Thank you, Mr. Dean. I really appreciate your short introduction, but very personal. It is an important moment for me to be able to face some young scholars here interested by the relationship between China, Europe, and Africa. It is a huge challenge, but I cannot begin our talk tonight without mentioning the fact that we are living a very special moment for France today, because we just learned a couple of minutes ago that Jacques Chirac passed away. You all know the strong friendship, the strong links that Jacques Chirac had with China. He's been a friend with many Chinese presidents and following very closely the relationship with Africa. So he's very much a symbol. I had a chance to work with him for some 30 years. So, of course, it is a specific and very moving moment. The subject we are going to talk about tonight is, I believe, one of the most important. And I choose to study during a couple of months this very specific subject because I was amazed to see that most of the media are concentrating on the China-US relation. And China-US is, of course, very important. But it should not hide some of the big challenges of the 21st century. And one of these important challenges is how are we going to deal with the African continent, which is a growing continent, and it will be so more and more during the whole century. To give you limited importance of the size of the problem, in 2050, African people will be 2.5 billion people. And in 2100, some of you might still be here. In 2100, there might be 4.5 billion Africans. That means that here, for example, in an assembly of scholars, 4 out of 10 among you will be coming from Africa. You can imagine how important will be the change with the situation today. So, an important challenge, and I have some personal reasons to discuss this subject. The first one is I'm born in Africa. I'm born in the northern part of Africa, the country which name is Morocco, and I served in Africa as a Navy officer when I was very, very young, maybe a little younger than what you are. And I served in Djibouti during the independence of Djibouti. So I don't know if you see where Djibouti is on the map. It's on the Horn of Africa, the eastern part, very near Ethiopia and Somalia. And Djibouti is one of the most important military base in the world. As a matter of fact, it is the champion of all the bases, because Djibouti is a base for France, historically. It is a base for Russia. It is a base for the United States. And it is a base for China. So you can imagine how important and strategic it is. The last reason that I have to deal with Africa is that when I was a young diplomat, for many years, I dealt with those issues, and mainly the crisis in Africa. I really learned to be a diplomat by studying the African crisis and by understanding how we should better react to those crises, who are quite frequent crises. There are many of them, and it's always interesting to try to see how the international community should react to those open, wounded situations. So I have 3 points, 3 messages I want to send to you tonight. The first one is to make a case about the African century. Of course, to start with, the 21st century is going to be the century of China. China will have the main responsibility in the world to try to give stability to our world, to impulse the international community, and to make things better, I hope, for most of the population of the world. But one of the key challenges would be Africa. Not only for demographic reasons, but for many others. I will just mention some of the assets of Africa. Of course, population is one important, but there is a second one, which is the importance of natural resources in Africa. Africa is the continent where you will find the most reserves of coltan, lithium, gold, diamonds, of course, a lot of oil, a lot of gas. So you can understand that strategically, every big power wants to have a part of Africa. The second reason is the importance of biodiversity and ecological resources. Of course, in that regard, Africa is a key continent. As a matter of fact, if we tell just the forest around the world, you have three key main forests in the world. You have the Amazonian forest. We've been talking a lot about Amazonia because the president of Brazil is today a man that doesn't care at all about the environment and doesn't care at all, just like Donald Trump, about its own forest and people living in the forest. The second big forest is Indonesia, and we talk a lot about it because the forest of Indonesia is facing a lot of fires, it's burning. And the third most important forest is Congo, in the center of Africa. It's a forest that is shared by 3 or 4 important countries of Africa, and that's of key importance to allow the planet to survive, because it takes the carbon and it maintains a strong balance, which is important for man as well as for biodiversity. The second point I want to make, following this one, to illustrate the rise of Africa in the 21st century, is the importance of the challenges, of the bottlenecks that Africa is facing. The first one is the lack of infrastructure. When you go around China, you are amazed to see how many highways, railways, ports, airports. In Africa, there are very few of them. And as a matter of fact, to go to one place to another place in Africa, and sometimes one capital next to the other one in the neighboring country, you have to go to Doha, you have to go to Dubai, or through Paris. So the lack of infrastructure is a strong issue for the economic development of the continent. It's a big, big problem. And sometimes, because you have 54 states in Africa, you don't even have the possibility to cross the borders. Some borders are closed. It is the case, for example, between Morocco and Algeria. Impossible to go from one country to the other. Even if the two countries have a lot of complementarity in terms of economic interest. You have one with a strong agriculture, the other one with strong energy reserves and strong and important mineral resources, but they don't have economic relation. Just in the northern part of Africa, we consider that because of this lack of communication between countries, they lose 2% growth. So you can imagine the impact of the lack of infrastructure, the impact of the lack of contact is very, very strong. The second bottleneck is the social bottleneck. It is the problem of a demographic time bomb. You have, like many emerging countries, a big change that happened in Africa with a much lower mortality because of the evolution of medical studies and medical capacity. So we've been fighting early deaths, but we don't have a lowering of natality. Natality is still very strong. They don't have the one-child policy. That's not in the mind of the continent. So population keeps growing. And of course, when you have such a huge number of people, you have to feed them. You have to get the growth somewhere and give them a future. There is a third bottleneck, which is also a very heavy weight on the growth of the continent, which is the political instability. That's a very delicate point because a problem of accountability of the elites. Very little transparency, a strong and important difficulty to have the possibility of changing leaders. Very often they stay for 15, 20, 40 years in the case of Zimbabwe. The former president just died. So you have a strong political issue that creates a process in which, because of the diversity of ethnies, because of the diversity of communities, the one who is leading the country is serving first its own community, and the rest of the population has difficulty in participating to the growth of the country, in benefiting from the resources of the country. So politics goes very much against equality, goes very much against I would say, a normal share among the population for cultural reasons, for ethnic reasons, for historical reasons. You have also, following this problem of political instability, a strong risk of political groups or military groups taking over the power, and that's all the problem of jihadism, the problem of radical movement, Islamist movements, that are of course, growing in some part of Africa. Everywhere where you have a crisis, you have such movements. In Nigeria, it's Boko Haram. In Mali, you have also some important terrorist groups, Al-Qaeda in Sahel, or Islamic State in Sahel, that are growing and disrupting the evolution of those countries. In most of the countries of Africa is the problem of succession. Many regimes, many countries have difficulty in changing the president. Even if you have election, the election is controlled by the people in place, and you have such a problem in Congo-Brazzaville, you have a problem in Cameroon, you had some problems in Benin. You have a difficult transition going on now in Sudan, with a lot of violence in the last months. And again, in Algeria, same issue. A lot of violence, even if the movement of the young people has been quite peaceful until now. We are now seeing some difficulties in trying to see where the movement is heading. In this context, we should assess certain numbers of new risk of catastrophes. Most of the experts, many of the experts, are looking at Africa with a pink eye. They believe that everything will be okay because Africa has more growth than what it used to have, and the historical process of change should continue to develop normally. We should not underestimate the risk of catastrophes in Africa if we want to avoid these catastrophes. So I will just mention some of the biggest challenges that Africa is facing today. The first one is the age of monster cities. In China, you have many examples of big cities. And of course, you know how to deal with such cities. But of course, if you transplant your mind in Africa, a big city doesn't resemble the cities you have in China. If you take, for example, a city like Kinshasa, which is the capital of Democratic Republic of Congo, and I was in Congo a couple of times this year in the last months, at 6:37 p.m., there is no electricity almost anywhere. So the life seems to stop, and you have millions and millions of people in the street. So you can imagine, in terms of insecurity, in terms of the economic life of the country, in terms of daily quality of life, the problems that you have behind, even problems of hygiene, which are growing, and that explains that, for example, in such a country like Democratic Republic of Congo, you have the big problem of the Ebola virus, which is one of the very important challenge for health control in Democratic Republic of Congo. So monster cities, that means we should take into account the reality on the ground. Of course, it's very tempting to apply to Africa the solution that had been found elsewhere. Or you can imagine, for example, that the huge experience that China has in construction could be applied to Africa. So why not buy big buildings in the cities of Africa? Of course, the culture is different and the reality is different. So the rules of urbanism, the capacity to be able to develop such buildings is not the same in those countries. So we have to think about the realities of the country and adapt the project. Small-scale projects are much more suitable in most of the countries in Africa than the type of big project that you have been developing in China. So you cannot transplant solutions from one continent to another without taking some risk. So at least one should be aware of this difficulty. So take into account new solutions in terms of transport. That's also an issue. In my paper, I try to illustrate some of the perspective that we could have in this sector, but choosing between a very heavy and expensive solution, like having fast-speed train everywhere in Africa, of having specific bus lines that could be secure, I believe the second option might be better. And if you take the example of a city like Curitiba, which is one small town in Brazil, where, as a matter of fact, President Lula is jailed, in Curitiba they have experienced fast line buses, and it has been a great experience, very cheap, not expensive at all, and successful. The same in terms of security, which is another issue in the big cities. If you take the example of a city like Medellin, which is a city in the northern part of Colombia, they have double the number of police officers and divided by 2 the numbers of murders and crime. So solutions can be successful even if they are very simple but adapted to the social realities of those countries. Second risk, important risk for Africa, it's the risk of war and crisis, the risk to have a new age of warring states. That's a big issue also. We should always try to push for better understanding between these countries. But of course, the question of borders, the question of tribes, and sometimes when you look into details at the situation in many African nations, you have tribes that are developing their community on several states, neighboring states. And that creates problems toward the central state of each country. So you have to take into account these daily realities if you want to be more effective. To avoid this logic of war which exists, of confrontation between countries, big transnational projects can be very helpful. It is the case today with the African Union. African Union have been doing a lot of progress in the last years. And for example, they are pushing forward the idea of President Kagame to have a special free trade zone for all the countries of Africa. And all the links that you can create, all the possibility to develop a real community between African states is, of course, something helpful because it creates knowledge and understanding between the different countries. The third risk of catastrophe is the competition of the big powers towards Africa. This is something we should take into account in the 70s, into the 80s. Maybe you don't remember this moment of history in Africa, but you had a big confrontation between the US and Soviet Union. You had a big confrontation between Cuba and many other countries. That was an element of destabilization. There is a risk because of resources, because of influence also, the quest for influence, there is a risk to have a new competition. Everybody today is trying to get a piece of influence in Africa. Take a country like Russia, for example. They are organizing for the first time this year, in a couple of weeks, a big event in Sochi, which will be President Putin meeting with all the leaders of Africa, like President Xi has been meeting a couple of months ago here in China, all the presidents of Africa. So everybody wants to have an African policy. This is the case for President Erdogan from Turkey and many other countries. So there is an African challenge. Everybody is interested in having an important influence of Africa. That's part of the new world. And if you don't have such an influence, of course, you might lose some capacities to act on the international scene. The second message I want to put forward in front of you today is a very important element, because we have to ask ourselves the question, should Africa copy what Europe has been doing in the last decade? Should Africa copy what China has been doing, or any foreign model? My strong belief is, of course, China should be inspired by the lessons of history, and there is a lot of examples of good cooperation, good practices that had important results in the development of Africa. But I think it's very important to understand that Africa has to find its own path of development. Africa has to find within itself the capacity to look to the world and show the world that they are taking their destiny into their own hand. The first point I want to make is the fact that today most of the powers around the world do have interest in having an important African policy. If you take Europe, Europe, of course, is interested in looking at Africa. First, because Africa is the closest continent near Europe. You just have a couple of kilometers to go on the Mediterranean, and then you are in Africa. And we are very close to all the problems that Africa has. To give you some examples, very often, unfortunately, in Europe, we speak about Africa only through the difficulties that comes from Africa. Immigration, terrorism, political instability, problems of disease. But Africa is more than all that, a strong element for the future. Africa is the future continent for growth. This is key. When you look at the situation in Europe, the growth in a country like France today is 1.2. Overall, in Europe, it's 1.1, 1.2, 1.3. Germany this year, 0.6 growth. Africa, you have countries ranging between 5, 6, and more than 10%. Of course, the younger a country, the more growth it will have. But the possibilities for the future for African countries is huge. And the more we will participate to the development of Africa, of course, the more we will be part of the new history, which is going to be the history of the new world. I believe that it is exactly the same for China. China has been developing a very strong policy with the advantage of not being a former colonial power and being able to develop a policy based on equality, on non-political requirements, and that has helped a lot China in gaining influence in those countries, while at the same time most of the European countries, they put very hard rules in terms of democracy, in terms of development requirement, in terms of social distribution. So it's two types of cooperation quite different. If you look at the evolution of cooperation from the side of Africa, I think it's quite important to understand that today African people and African leaders do understand that they really need the help of outside powers. And Africans understand that a centered development based on their own forces cannot help them to face the current situation in which they are, which is, for one part, to be in the Middle Ages, and from another part, to be part of the world that we all know. They are in globalization. and they have at the same time a candle sometimes in their house because they don't have electricity, but they have also internet in some cases, or the children are dealing with internet. So we have to reconcile these two situations, which is possibly creating some kind of a schizophrenia, which is quite dangerous. And we need to help them in pushing forward and gaining time. And I believe that contrary to many models, contrary to many analyses of development, I'm not sure you have to go to all the stages of development, one by one, to be a modern country. And I think Africa is able to go forward in taking a straight line, passing from Middle Ages to the technological era. So how to deal with those issues? Of course, it is a history which is not written. You need imagination, you need new processes, you need a new type of education. But I believe that there is a creativity in the continent, and that's where we have to take into account the cultural resources of the continent. The African people are optimistic. They are not looking backward, they are looking to the future, and they are creative. So based on this capacity, I think we really can do a lot of things and be able to realize a lot of challenges. What would be this African path of development? What would be the basis? I think there is 3 or 4 criteria that we should put forward. The first one is culture. This path of development should be based on the African culture. We are not paying enough attention to the growing numbers of intellectuals, the growing number of analyst experts in Africa that are explaining today what are the reality of Africa. And you have a lot of very good intellectuals, people like Achille Mbembe in Cameroon, people like Felwine Sarr in Senegal. These people, we should listen more to them and understand what is the African identity. Africa is a very old civilization. As a matter of fact, the first man we know is coming from the African continent, and we should not only respect but try to understand the specificities, the cultural specificities of the continent if we want to be effective in cooperating with them. So culture is number one. The number two is strong respect for nature and environment. For unfortunately, many decades in the colonial era and after, we have not respected enough the nature of Africa, and development has destroyed many species, many balanced landscapes, and we should really go ahead in taking into account that these resources are not necessarily renewable. So we should really care with the Africans and respecting and controlling such an evolution. The third criteria, I believe, is very important, is to build up a path of development based on people. And there are at least 3 targets I think we should deal with and take it more into account. The first one is the young generation. There is a strong appetite in this young generation, a strong optimism, and we should not disappoint them. So we should help them in terms of education, in terms of offering them more possibilities. This is a target that we should really take into account. The second one is women. Women in the ecosystem of Africa is very important because she is in charge of education. She is really the spirit in many villages. She does represent tradition. She transmits tradition as well as the elders. So for many objectives, women will be an ally and help us into getting the word in order to facilitate development in many regions. The third target is what we call diaspora, is the immigrants coming from Africa and living abroad, some in China, a lot of them in Europe, countries like France, Germany. These people, they come to Europe or they come to China and they send every month most of what they earn to their village and to their family and people. And of course, that does represent a lot of money for the development of the continent, and we should be careful in trying to really make the best out of this financial contribution. The third message, of course, is how, starting with the analysis, how should we the best contribute to the development of Africa, is to consider the possibility to enter in a new age of cooperation. My understanding is today that Africa is, for any country, out of reach in terms of financial availability, in terms of importance of challenges. Not just one single country can take the charge of everything and do the job. I believe that a group of countries can really take this responsibility and help Africa to fasten possibilities of development. And to my understanding, the two groups of countries that are the best in situation to help is, on one side, because of geography and history and cultural tradition, Europe on one side, and China, because of the involvement of China starting in the 1990s, a little before, but much more in the starting from the 1990s. Both group of countries have the capacity to give an impulse if they work well together. I think, besides that, that there is a strong argument to advocate such a new policy. It is the fact that we live in a world where competition and confrontation are the rule. I think Europe and China can show the world that we are able to work together, not just for our own interest, but for the development of this important continent, which is Africa. So I think the value of this cooperation is to set an example in a moment where the logic of confrontation is taking over. And I think it's a fantastic response to Donald Trump's unilateralism, to Donald Trump's policy of let's make America great again, to show that a multilateral approach can be the solution and can work and have success. It is important in this very moment of history to show that a free cooperation between two great entities, China and Europe, can be the response of the world community. And again, the world community doesn't have much successes. That's one of the big difficulties. So people, they say, well, nothing is working and we are not going to avoid a war. How could we work together usefully? I think Africa is one of the sectors where we could work usefully and take the lessons of the past. So what are, if we agree with this idea that a triangular cooperation could be the best solution, what should be the main lines? I will give you 4 lines which I believe are the most important today. The first one is transnationalization. I believe that if we have a common approach of cooperation and development, we should work with not just one country or one project in a country, but on the basis of cross-border investment, on the basis of a group of nations. Transnationalization makes it a lot easier for Europe and China to work together because we go beyond local politics. We are in projects that could be good for an important area, that could be good and give benefit for different groups of people and for different states. I believe that this is a choice that will be the most efficient and the most normal. So what transnationalization would mean? I think, to take an example, it will bring a new framework in order to stabilize the commodity prices. If we create together, Europe and China, a compensation fund for commodity, I think we will create the possibility, the tool for African countries to be able to preview the evolution of prices. Today, one of the big difficulties, whether they sell copper or mineral resources or oil, is they don't know how much they will have in 1, 2, 4, 5 years. It's very difficult to make a budget when you are such in a difficulty in previewing the future. This compensation fund will give them the capacity to know better and to make plans ahead. China has been very good in the last decades to organize its own development through different phases because you were having the capacity of planification. I think Africa will do a lot better if they have a much bigger, longer horizon. So we should give them the tools to master a little more their destiny. If we take another example, security. If we could define together China and Europe within the framework of the UN, if we could really try to set common rules of engagement in crisis, will create a certain rationality which is lacking today when we are facing crisis. Most of the time, one country, a group of countries, or the UN through the peacekeeping troops are helping, but this is not an organized process of the international community, or at least not enough organized. So I believe it's time really to have a strong coordination in order to be able to be more effective. The third orientation for transnationalization would be to support the idea of a greater economic integration of Africa, which is the evolution of the African Union. I think the more you will have such an integration, the more efficient the project will be. It's much easier to work with a limited group of countries than with 54 countries, each one having their own rules, each one having their own policies. That creates a lot of difficulties when you want to work with the market. The second line should be, I believe, platformization, because platformization means the capacity to take into account the size of Africa. Today you have very few dedicated social networks to the continent. If you want to know what is well done in Ghana, what is well done in Rwanda, what is well done in Ethiopia, you have no social network that is compiling all these good practices. We should have, at the level of universities, at the level of think tanks, the capacity to create such platforms, such network, to share information, to share experiences, to share experiences of development, to share good practices of NGOs. All this, it's lost very often in terms of information, and it's not duplicated when the experience is good. So we should really, again, have the tools to be able to transmit and to collect the information. The same for seminars and forums. In China, there is not one single day where you have, when you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 forums in the same city. You can see in big hotels, people discussing, meeting, sharing ideas. In Africa, you don't have much of that. And when you are looking for development, you need to think, you need to share, you need to discuss, you need to debate. And that's an important part also of what should be this new step, this new stage for Africa. Third element for this platformization should be state-building platforms. Africa has a huge problem of organization in each country. I'm not talking about rule of law, I'm just talking about state building, having civil servants, making sure that everyone respects the rules. Such state building effort should be not only encouraged by the UN, but I think Europe and China should share some capacities in order to help the process of development of those countries. You have to understand that what most of the emerging countries are facing is the problem of nation-state building. The process of modernization of a state is very complicated. It started in Europe in the 19th century, then it has gone in Asia at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, and all the time and everywhere, the creation, the building of a nation state goes through violence. In Europe, we went into civil wars, world wars. In Asia, it has been also a very complicated process. Today, the region which is facing this problem of nation state is Middle East. And that explains why the Middle East is in fire. And they have wars, they have crises, they have confrontation. So it's a difficult process. Tomorrow, Africa will be going through this process. So we should be aware that they are going to face new difficulties. To explain the situation and why in some countries it might be a little bit different, some countries have been through this struggle in the last years. It has been the case of South Africa through apartheid, huge challenge and an incredible experience for the whole South African community in order to build a sense of nation. Another country, through genocide, Rwanda, has gone through this experience. And that explains the position as a leader of Rwanda today, because having gone through such a difficult process, they have the advantage of knowing the risks. And this process is, of course, a very delicate process. And the more you can help awareness, education, apprentissage in those countries, the more they will avoid violence and difficult and complex processes. Last element of platformization should be specific policies for regional crises. The conflicting policies, demobilization for soldiers who have been participating to wars, social reinsertion for soldiers or young boys that had been thrown into a violent crisis. All these processes should be more organized, prepared by the international community, starting, I believe, by Europe and China. What could be the third line besides transnationalization and platformization? I think we need to have a differentiated mobilization depending on the countries. We cannot have just one approach of Africa as a whole. We should choose specific targets in order to create showcases in countries and regions to show that, yes, it is possible. So, what are the countries today that we should even more encourage to create some kind of a virtuous circle? A country like Rwanda, a country like South Africa, even if right now the situation is quite difficult socially and politically in South Africa, Ethiopia, who has been able to go forward with some very good successes. Again, even they are going through ethnic issues quite complicated. Country like Morocco, which is maybe the only stable country in northern part of Africa, choosing such targets and trying to push ahead new possibilities of cooperation will lead the rest of the continent and create this positive circle that I'm wishing for. Last big line I think we should encourage is the focalization on good policies and good projects. We cannot do everything from the outside. We should concentrate on some specific issues and problems. I will give you one or two examples. The first one is urbanization. There are a lot of very important techniques, very important works to be done, like, for example, water treatment, that Africa is needing. We should create a pool of companies, Chinese companies, European companies, that can provide at a very low cost project in Africa that will be applied within a very short period of time. Because we have to understand that in Africa, if we are going to tell most of this population and people that, okay, we are starting now, but it will only be working in 20 years, this is too long. We need projects that can be realized in 1, 2, 3 years, and people will see the results. Because this creates a strong desire to see more and to work harder. We need result, positive results and creativity. That is the positive cycle I'm wishing for. So urban development is one sector. Electricity is one of the biggest challenges for Africa. And of course, education sector, try to create partnership between schools, university, in our countries and in Africa in order to create such partnership at every stage. It can be true at the level of cities, it can be true at the level of provinces, it can be true at the level of states, but create a strong emulation. Create the idea that our destiny and the destiny of Africa are very much linked, and then we might create also a new mindset, a new mood in the world, showing that confrontation, the logic of war and confrontation, is not the only logic that is prevailing. So you see how important at the end is not only Africa, but a new approach to Africa. If we continue to do as we have done in the past, and again, many of the projects that have been launched within Africa are good projects and giving results. But we are not going to be at the level of the expectation of the African people, neither we are going to go fast enough because of the importance of the challenges. So this is a race. It is a competition between us and time, between violence and daily realities, and we need to cope with those difficulties in order to create a new situation that might enhance the chances of winning this competition. Thank you very much.